Hey guys, tonight, we're dialing back the clock way back beyond the knights in shining armor and the dramatic joust into the much less glamorous reality of medieval life. Specifically, we're going to try and slip into the rough wool cloak of a medieval peasant on one of the coldest nights of the year. Picture this: you're huddled in a small, smoky hut. The wind is howling outside like a banshee auditioning for a heavy metal band. And inside isn't exactly much better. The air hangs heavy and damp, carrying the smells of stale wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something you're trying not to identify wafting up from the floor. Your breath, yes, your breath forms tiny clouds that linger for just a moment before being swallowed by the frigid air. It's the kind of cold that seeps deep into your bones, the kind that makes your fingers and toes ache even before you settle down. Let's be real, by modern standards, you probably wouldn't last a night. The thermostat here isn't set to cozy, it's firmly stuck on survival mode, if that. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Hearing where you are makes this feel a bit more connected. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pull the rough, scratchy fabric tighter around your shoulders, feeling the meager warmth trapped there, immediately fighting against the invading chill. It's deep winter, the kind of winter they really don't make anymore, where frost seems to grow indoors. You can practically hear the ice crystals forming on the inside of the wattle and daub walls, even if you can't see them clearly in the gloom. The only significant light source is the small fire sputtering heroically in the central hearth. Its meager glow casting dancing, eerie shadows that twist familiar objects into monstrous shapes in the corners of the room. Every now and then, a gust of wind finds a gap. And trust me, there are plenty of gaps. And sends a shiver through the structure, carrying with it a blast of air so cold, it steals your breath away for a second. It feels like the outside world is actively trying to break in. And honestly, you're not sure how well these flimsy walls are holding up the defense. Living as a medieval peasant meant being almost completely at the mercy of the elements. Forget double glazing, central heating, or even a properly insulated attic. Your home was likely a one-room dwelling shared not just with your family, but also potentially with livestock, if it was an especially harsh night. Or you had valuable animals you wanted to keep safe from wolves or thieves. A concept that sounds wildly unappealing to our modern sensibilities, unless you're really into competitive air fresheners. This practice, sharing living quarters with animals known as a longhouse type structure, even on a smaller scale, was actually pretty common, providing a small but sometimes significant amount of extra body heat. Think of it as medieval four-legged free-range space heaters. You try to find a slightly less damp spot on the floor, pulling a coarse wool blanket, probably smelling suspiciously of sheep around your legs. The floor is likely packed earth, potentially covered with a layer of straw or rushes that, let's be kind, isn't changed as often as it should be. It accumulates dirt, spilled food waste, and who knows what else over time. This layered floor covering was called strewing. It offered a tiny bit of insulation, but mostly provided a fertile breeding ground for, well, everything you don't want breeding indoors. Imagine dropping your dinner on the floor, in your cozy, modern kitchen. Probably okay after a quick clean. Here, just mourn your lost calorie. It's gone forever. Probably already contributing to the local microbiome flourishing just below your feet. Mainstream historical fact alert. Most medieval peasant homes, particularly in Northern Europe, were simple structures, primarily made of wattle and daub. Woven wooden strips wattle, daubed with a mixture of clay, animal dung, and straw daub. This was quick and relatively cheap to build, but offered very poor insulation compared to stone or even well-built timber frames, leaving you highly vulnerable to temperature swings. It's like living in a house made mostly of mud and hopes. Now, for a quirky tidbit. While windows were sometimes present, especially by the later medieval period, they were often small and not made of glass for peasant homes. If they had them at all, they might use wooden shutters or perhaps stretched animal hide, treated with oil to let in a little diffuse light while blocking the wind. Trying to see outside at night through a piece of oily cow skin doesn't exactly scream panoramic view, does it? It sounds more like squinting through a used frying pan liner. You shift uncomfortably. The damp seems to cling to everything. Your clothes, your blanket. The very air itself feels heavy with moisture. The fire is beautiful, yes, in its primitive way a focal point of life in this dark box, but the smoke is a constant companion, irritating your eyes and lining your throat. Medieval hearths often lacked proper chimneys or only had a simple hole in the roof, a smoke hole, which let heat out almost as efficiently as smoke. This is another reason why smoky, damp air was just a standard feature of peasant life. Historians still argue whether indoor smoke was tolerated out of necessity, or if medieval lungs were somehow just tougher. My money is on tolerated out of necessity. Because honestly, who enjoys coughing all the time? The soundscape is sparse, the wind, the occasional creak of the hut, the soft breathing of others nearby, and maybe the rustle of rats in the straw. No comforting hum of a refrigerator, no gentle whirring of a fan you can turn on just for noise. It's a quiet world dominated by natural sounds, punctuated by the occasional groan from someone else struggling against the cold and damp. Sleep isn't something you just drift into easily. It's a battle fought against discomfort, cold, and the low-level anxiety of just trying to make it through another night. The air is thick, not just with smoke and moisture, but with the unspoken understanding that tonight is just one more hurdle in a long season of just trying to survive. The walls around you are probably the best defense you have, and that's frankly a bit concerning when you consider what they're made of. As we touched on, it's wattle and daub. Think of it like nature's drywall if nature was really trying to discourage comfortable living. You have a framework of relatively sturdy vertical wooden posts driven into the ground. Between these thinner, flexible branches, or osiers, willow shoots are woven horizontally like a giant loose basket. That's the wattle part. Now, picture slapping mud clay often mixed with animal dung. Yup. It's a structural ingredient, straw and maybe lime over that woven framework, both inside and out. That's the daub. This mixture is pressed and smoothed into the gaps and over the wattle, eventually drying into a surprisingly tough, but by no means airtight wall. It does keep most of the wind out most of the time, but insulating, nah. That wasn't high on the design priorities list, probably filed somewhere below attract woodland fairies. You can imagine the drafts. They sneak in everywhere, through hairline cracks as the daub dries and shrinks around the ill-fitting door, through the ever-present smoke hole in the roof, or just vibrating right through the surprisingly thin structure itself. It's like trying to stop a determined ant with a picket fence. The cold air isn't just outside, it feels like it's breathing through the walls, chilling the very stones beneath your feet. You might try stuffing some extra straw into visible cracks, but it feels like plugging a leaky dam with wishes. A valiant effort perhaps, but ultimately futile against the relentless pressure of a proper winter. The roof above your head is most likely thatched. This involves layering dried vegetation like straw, reeds, or heather onto a timber frame. Thatching can be surprisingly good at keeping water out if done well, like surprisingly impressively waterproof even. But for insulation, it's a mixed bag. A thick thatch roof does provide some thermal resistance better than plain wood planks, certainly. However, it's also prone to rot harbors vermin like the rats you heard rustling earlier. They love nesting in thatch and, as you know, made of extremely dry, flammable plant matter, suspended directly over your indoor bonfire. Fireplaces without proper chimneys. Thatched roofs. It's a combination that must have kept the local medieval fire brigade spoiler. There weren't any relatively unemployed probably because everything just burnt down instantly anyway. If you squint, you might see motes of dust and bits of dried plant material drifting down from the roof timbers, constant reminders of what's literally over your head. Some regions, especially poorer or wetter ones, might have used turf roofs. This involved stacking layers of earth and grass sods onto wooden planks supported by more substantial timbers. These were even heavier and provided decent insulation, arguably better than thatch, but required robust support structures and could be damp. Walking on a turf roof in spring sounds rustic. Definitely less charming than a scene from a Hobbit movie. Be right back, just mowing the roof. Mainstream historical fact check. Wattle and daub, along with timber-framed buildings and filled with wattle and daub, or sometimes brick, more common in later periods, and wealthier homes were standard construction methods for medieval peasant housing. Across much of Europe, due to the readily available materials, wood, clay, earth, and vegetation. Doors were usually simple affairs. A few wooden planks nailed together, perhaps reinforced with some cross battens. Hinges might be made of iron or even just looped rope or leather. Latching mechanisms were basic wooden bars or pegs. Security was less about preventing sophisticated break-ins and more about keeping out opportunistic animals or highly motivated ne'er-do-wells. As you might expect, they fit imperfectly into their frames, allowing a significant amount of cold air to leak in around the edges. Every time someone enters or leaves, a tidal wave of freezing outdoor air blasts through the room, reminding everyone why leaving is generally discouraged once you're hunkered down for the night. Trying to get the door to sit perfectly snug seems like an engineer's bad dream given the rough-hewn nature of the frame. You push it closed, but it still feels porous. Quirky tidbit time. Archaeological digs of medieval peasant house sites often reveal very little beyond post holes, and perhaps some traces of a hearth, due to the perishable nature of wattle and daub and thatch materials. Because these structures used such humble natural and non-durable resources, they tended to just decompose back into the earth over time, leaving only the most permanent elements. So while lords' castles stand in ruins for centuries, your average peasant home might leave barely a trace after a few decades. It's the ultimate in the low-impact housing. I guess biodegradable architecture? Thinking about the lack of real insulation makes you appreciate modern technology like, well, just insulation, doesn't it? Even the cheapest fiberglass bats feel like a high-tech miracle compared to a layer of mud and dung on sticks. There's no thermal bridge here. The whole wall is basically a thermal bridge. The heat generated by your small fire and the collective body heat of everyone crammed into this space, yes, that's a significant factor, radiates out into the night air with alarming efficiency. It's a constant losing battle against entropy waged with sticks and dirt. Historians still argue whether medieval builders truly understood the concept of insulation, or if the slightly better performance of certain materials like thick thatch or earth walls was simply a happy side effect of choosing dense, abundant materials that block the wind and rain effectively. Whatever the case, cozy wasn't in the blueprint. It's more like living in a well-built, slightly drafty shed that occasionally has farm animals in it. As the cold permeates deeper, you can almost feel the frosty air molecules doing a little jig just on the other side of the daub, impatient for their turn to slip through a crack and chill you further. It's not just a lack of heating, it's an active feeling of the barrier between you and the deadly outside being frighteningly thin and permeable. Every little breeze feels like an intrusion, a tiny cold finger poking its way into your sanctuary, reminding you how vulnerable you are in this simple shell. Even if the walls offered perfect insulation, and the fire burned endlessly without smoke, the cold would still find you not just from the outside air, but from the inside out, from hunger. Because enduring the medieval winter isn't just about finding shelter from the physical cold, it's also about surviving the prolonged period of food scarcity. Tonight, curled up in the gloom, you feel the familiar ache in your stomach. Dinner was... well, it was filling in theory maybe, but hardly what you'd call nourishing by today's standards. You consumed whatever was left over from the day's meal, likely a bowl of pottage, which is basically the historical equivalent of soup that's thick enough to stand a spoon in maybe. It's a thick stew, primarily grain like barley or oats, perhaps some dried peas or beans if you were lucky, and whatever miserable scrap of vegetable might have survived storage. Maybe a root vegetable that's gone a bit soft. The flavor profile is overwhelmingly earthy and monotonous. You can practically taste the gray. Winter meant the fresh produce of summer and autumn harvest were long gone. No sweet berries, no crisp apples right off the tree, no green salads as if medieval peasants were dining on salads anyway. Your survival now depended entirely on how successfully you preserved the harvest. And preservation methods were simple and genius for their time, but resulted in food that was, shall we say, robust in texture and assertive in flavor. We're talking heavily salted meat, if you even had. Meat, dried fish, dried peas and beans, stored root vegetables like parsnips and turnips, which get sweeter after a frost, a small mercy, maybe some rough, tough cheese. Your bread, if you have it, is made from the cheapest grains available, often barley, rye, or oats, possibly mixed with cheaper, less nutritious fillers in tougher times. White bread made from finely milled wheat. That was Lord's fare, fancy stuff. Your bread is probably dark heavy and has the potential to double as a defensive weapon in a pinch. Salting was a key technique for meat and fish. Layers and layers of salt would draw out the moisture, preventing spoilage. The downside. Everything tasted incredibly, overwhelmingly salty. Reconstituting salted meat meant boiling it multiple times just to make it edible, a process that leached out some of the salt, yes, but also a fair amount of flavor and nutrients. Still better than rotting meat. Drying was common for fruits, if any lasted that long, and for fish. Imagine a wind-dried herring. Now imagine eating it. Raw, yep. It was less snack and more necessary caloric intake to avoid starvation. Root vegetables were stored in pits dug in the ground, covered with straw and earth. These clamp storage systems kept the vegetables cool and relatively stable, extending their life well into winter. But inevitably, some would rot. Some would get nibbled by rodents, another unwelcome tenant of your dwelling, and the quality would decrease over time. The parsnips you dug up in late autumn are a lot softer and less appealing by February. They were often boiled for hours into the aforementioned pottage. Variety was not the spice of medieval winter life. The culinary adventure for you was less trying a new recipe and more, is this moldy or just textured mainstream historical fact for you? Cereals, particularly barley, rye, and oats, formed the absolute cornerstone of the medieval peasant diet, primarily consumed in the form of bread and pottage. Meat and fish were seasonal luxuries more often consumed after a successful hunt, usually poaching, risking harsh penalties, or in preserved form, or rarely after an animal had to be slaughtered, perhaps due to injury. Dairy was often consumed as cheese or butter for better preservation than fresh milk. For your quirky tidbit, medieval peasants often had a brew made from weaker, small beer or ale. This wasn't for getting tipsy in the modern sense. Water quality could be dodgy, so fermenting grains created a safer, though low-alcohol drink that was consumed throughout the day, even by children. It provided hydration and some minimal calories. Think of it as the original proto-Gatorade, but less tasty and more likely to make you burp impressively. So your hydration plan in medieval times often involved slightly alcoholic, lukewarm liquid. Cheers. The constant blandness and lack of nutrients took its toll. By late winter, you'd be facing the hungry gap. The period after winter stores started running critically low and before the first crops of spring were ready to harvest. This was a time of serious vulnerability where hunger wasn't just discomfort, but a real threat to your health and ability to work the coming season. You were existing on rations that were nutritionally sparse and deeply unsatisfying. You try to remember the taste of a fresh plum from summer, the sweetness bursting in your mouth. It feels like a distant dream. Tonight's supper was necessary fuel, not a meal to be savored. You eat because you have to, not because you want to. Food preparation was also simple and focused on stretching limited resources. Everything went into the pottage pot simmering over the fire. Leftovers, tough vegetables, grains. Boiling was the primary cooking method, conserving precious fuel wood compared to roasting. Meat, when available, might be boiled or sometimes preserved further by smoking over the fire, adding another layer to the already thick air of your home. The smoke wasn't just annoying, it was a byproduct of trying to keep your ham from turning into something unrecognizable and actively harmful. Historians still argue whether medieval peasant diets were, despite their simplicity and seasonality, adequately nutritious on the whole, or if they suffered from chronic deficiencies that weakened them and made them more susceptible to disease. Considering the challenges, it's hard to imagine it being a picture of perfect health and vitality. You certainly don't feel vital as your stomach rumbles faintly in the cold. It feels more like your body is politely suggesting you find something better to eat, preferably yesterday. But yesterday's meal was pretty much the same as today's, and likely the same as tomorrow's. This cycle of monotonous, often insufficient food adds another layer of hardship to the bone-chilling cold you're trying to ignore. You settle down feeling the pangs of hunger mix with the ache of cold. Sleeping on an empty-ish stomach in freezing conditions isn't easy, but it's a regular part of life here. So you've got minimal walls, questionable food stores, and the unrelenting chill pressing in. Your next line of defense, or perhaps your primary one once you're indoors, is what you're wearing, or more accurately, what you're layered in. As you shift trying to find a slightly more comfortable spot among the rushes and assorted floor debris, you feel the insistent, ever-present scratchiness of wool. Forget soft merino or cozy cashmere. Medieval peasant wool was rustic. It was made from the hardy sheep common at the time, spun into coarse yarn and woven into a fabric that felt less like clothing and more like wearable barbed wire dipped in sandpaper. Every movement sends a little jolt of itchiness across your skin. You're likely wearing layers because that was the only way to trap any kind of body heat. Directly against your skin might be a linen shift or tunic. Linen was easier to clean, relatively speaking, for the era, dried faster than wool, and wasn't quite as aggressively prickly, offering a minimal barrier. However, it wasn't warm at all. It was just less cold than direct wool contact and absorbed sweat, which could then make you colder. Think of it as medieval activewear, except instead of wicking sweat, it mostly just held onto it tenaciously, giving you that delightful damp dog feeling underneath everything. Over the linen comes the wool, layer upon layer if you're lucky. Your basic outfit likely consists of a wool tunic. For a man, this would be a knee-length or mid-calf garment. For a woman, it would likely be ankle-length. It's a simple T-shape, maybe sewn together with thick thread. No complex tailoring here. Think sack with holes for head and arms. These tunics were probably heavy and stiff, particularly if made of fulled wool, a process involving soaking and beating the fabric to make it denser and more water-repellent. Another crucial defense against damp, which, as you know, is a constant enemy indoors and out. The weight of it feels substantial, like wearing a rough-hewn blanket all the time. It traps a bit of warmth, but the airflow, while preventing you from getting too sweaty while working. Because, let's be honest, not much rigorous activity is happening right now. Huddled by the fire also means heat escapes pretty easily. Below your tunic covering your legs, you'd likely have some form of leg coverings. For men, this was often chausses or hose, separate leggings tied to your belt or waistline. They could be made of wool or sometimes woven slightly stretchier material. Imagine thick, unyielding tights made from your least favorite wool sweater that shrunk in the wash. For women, a long shift in tunic provided some leg covering, though. Outer gowns could be layered for extra warmth. And for your feet, simple wool or cloth foot coverings, often wrapped rather than tailored like socks worn inside leather shoes or turn shoes. Simple shoes sewn inside out and then turned or possibly crude wooden clogs, which provided some barrier against the damp floor but zero insulation. Your toes are probably already cold, frankly. They always are. Mainstream historical fact for this segment: wool was by far the most common and important textile for clothing across all social classes in medieval Europe, particularly for outer garments due to its availability, warmth, and relative durability compared to plant fibers in many climates. Linen was used for undergarments and lighter clothing, especially in warmer weather or regions. Adding another layer, perhaps a hooded cloak or a mantle fastened at the shoulder, is crucial in cold weather, even indoors if you aren't directly beside the fire. A simple semi-circular cloak of heavy wool or even animal skins could make a significant difference in trapping that precious body heat around your core. You can pull the hood up now, letting the scratchy wool rough your hair, but feeling that slight reduction in chill around your neck and ears. The hoods often had liripipes, long, dangling tails, which served no functional purpose on their own in staying warm, though people would wrap them around their necks like scarves sometimes. More fashion than function, perhaps proving even in dire times a little flair wasn't totally off the table, which, considering the state of your trousers, might be the only bit of flair you possess. These clothes weren't off the rack from some medieval mall. Again, spoiler, there wasn't one. They were likely made at home. The wool came from your lord's sheep, maybe sheared as part of your required labor, or from your own if you were fortunate enough to own one or two. It was washed imperfectly, carded, combed, spun into yarn using a drop spindle or a simple spinning wheel, and then woven on a hand loom. Sewing was done by hand using bone needles and rough thread. Everything about it speaks of manual labor, lack of fine finish, and functional simplicity. Think of the worst knitting project you ever attempted. Then wear it constantly for a year. Quirky tidbit time. Medieval peasant clothing was rarely washed, particularly outer woolens, as wool is difficult to clean and slow to dry using medieval methods. Linen undergarments might be washed more frequently, perhaps by beating them in a stream. Wool was more often aired out or potentially smoked to refresh it slightly, leading to smells we modern folks would probably find pungent. Your clothes hold not just your body heat, but the accumulated smells of sweat, smoke, animal proximity, and the general miasma of daily medieval life. It's a personal perfume you carry with you. You can feel the stiffness of the fabric against your skin, hear the rustle of the layers as you shift. Staying clean was incredibly difficult, and these thick wool garments retained dirt grime, and unfortunately likely attracted some persistent tiny creatures looking for a warm home. Sleep is interrupted not just by the cold, but by the occasional need to scratch an intense itch. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of tough, uncomfortable fabrics like coarse wool contributed to chronic skin irritations or other ailments among the peasant class. Frankly, feeling this material against your skin, it seems less like a debate and more like a medical certainty. You try to tuck your hands further into your sleeves, seeking refuge from the cold, the coarse fabric brushing your knuckles. It's not comfort you're seeking here, just a marginal reduction in discomfort. The weight of the clothes is substantial, another presence pressing down on you in the dim, cold space. It's a constant physical reminder of your low status and the harsh necessities of your life. You wrap your cloak a little tighter around your feet, trying to keep them from going completely numb. Each layer adds some defense, but it's a constant uphill battle against the biting cold that finds its way through the weaves of the fabric around loose cuffs and up from the freezing ground. It's a humble, unglamorous armor against the medieval winter, providing just enough warmth to perhaps make it through the night. Coupled with persistent discomfort and the lingering knowledge that these garments are far from clean. So you've got a basic shelter, meager provisions, itchy clothing, and the dark. How do you generate meaningful warmth? The fire. The heart of the home, quite literally in many medieval peasant dwellings. The small pile of burning wood and embers in the center of your hut is the sole source of both light and significant heat after sundown. It's a mesmerizing, dangerous focal point. You watch the flames lick upwards, casting those restless shadows. We talked about the only dynamic element in the otherwise static, dark room. The warmth radiating from it is intense if you're sitting close, almost scorching your skin on one side, while the other remains stubbornly chilled by the ambient air. It's a warmth you cling to, a physical anchor in the sea of cold. Fuel for the fire wasn't just conveniently purchased in bags at a medieval equivalent of a gas station, obviously. Collecting firewood was a perpetual chore, often part of the duties owed to the Lord. You spent hours gathering fallen branches in the woods, chopping what smaller trees you were allowed access to, hauling bundles back to your hut. Dry wood was essential. Damp wood smoked terribly and burned inefficiently, which you are intimately familiar with right now. That hazy layer in the air isn't just ambiance. It's unburned particulate matter doing its best to shorten your lifespan. The central hearth is a simple depression in the packed earth floor, perhaps lined with a few stones to contain the embers. There's no raised fireplace, no mantelpiece to hang stockings on. Not that you have stockings or a concept of Christmas capitalism, but you get the idea. The fire burns directly on the floor. This placement was strategic. Heat rises, yes, but having the source low to the ground helps warm the coldest air first, and the glowing embers also radiated a small amount of heat into the earth, offering a marginal improvement to the otherwise frigid floor you're sitting on. However, it also meant fire was constantly at floor level, dangerously close to everything and everyone, including sleeping children, scattered straw, a huge fire risk, and roaming livestock if they were indoors with you. It's amazing medieval homes didn't burn down even more often than they probably did. Every stray spark landing on the rush flooring is an oh heck moment. As the evening wears on and the fire begins to die down, the challenge is to keep some embers alive for the next morning. You might carefully cover the embers with ash, a practice called curfew, derived from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire, which insulated the coals and allowed them to smolder through the night, providing a little continuous, though vastly reduced heat, and allowing you to relight the fire easily in the morning, without needing tinder and flint all over again in the freezing dark. This act of covering the fire for the night is another small ingrained ritual of survival in your daily life. Lighting was primarily from this fire or from simple lamps or candles if you could afford them. Peasants typically used rushlights or tallow candles. Rushlights were literally dried rushes the plant dipped in grease or fat. They produced a smoky, flickering light burned down quickly and smelled of burning fat and vegetation. Not exactly aromatherapy. Tallow candles made from animal fat were slightly better, but still smelled, and dripped profusely. Imagine trying to read by the light of something that smells like a frying pan and keeps leaving grease stains. The dim, unsteady light barely pushes back the encroaching darkness. Reading wasn't common anyway, as literacy rates were low, but even simple tasks were difficult after dark. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was a physical, tangible presence in the hut, filled with the shapes your tired eyes made out of the shadows. Mainstream historical fact. Break fire was not only crucial for heat and light, but also for cooking purification of water by boiling, and as a social gathering point. The shared hearth symbolized the unity of the household and was central to evening life. Working by this poor light was nearly impossible and certainly dangerous with anything sharp. Even sitting near the fire didn't provide enough reliable light for fine work like sewing. Most activities that required visibility ceased entirely when the sun went down. Life shifted profoundly with the setting of the sun, becoming quieter, darker, and centered entirely around the hearth and surviving the night. There's no popping on a bright overhead light or flicking on a desk lamp here, just varying degrees of gloom and flickering danger. Quirky detail-time medieval belief sometimes held that certain creatures or spirits roamed more freely in the dark. The pervasive darkness and limited light didn't just present practical challenges, they fed into cultural fears and superstitions, making the night seem even more imposing and potentially threatening. Hard to feel totally at ease when the shadows in the corner might be anything according to village gossip and your only defense is a sputtering rush dipped in the last week's beef fat. It's definitely less Netflix and chill and more wait nervously for dawn. You poke the fire with a stick trying to encourage a lazy ember. It's a constant management task. Feed it just enough to keep it going without using up your precious wood too quickly. Make sure a spark doesn't jump. Try to deflect the smoke from stinging your eyes for the 10th time. The air is heavy with that perpetual wood smoke, a smell that you've probably stopped consciously noticing, but which permeates your clothes, your hair, and the very structure of the hut. Historians still argue whether the chronic smoke inhalation from medieval indoor fires significantly impacted respiratory health and overall lifespan. It's certainly hard to imagine it was beneficial. Coughing is a frequent companion in this space. The darkness beyond the immediate firelight is total and profound. No light pollution here, save for maybe a distant hearth. Glow from a neighbor's hut on the other side of the small cluster of dwellings. It's the kind of darkness where you can't see your hand in front of your face. The feeble flickering lights serve only to emphasize the vastness of the dark they fail to conquer. And it's in this environment that you huddle the life-giving fire, your only guardian against the cold, and the consuming night, a powerful but fragile protector, constantly demanding your attention and fuel. The cold outside isn't just biting, it's often accompanied by early sunsets and long, long nights. With the fields frozen or covered in snow, most outdoor agricultural labor grinds to a halt for a good portion of winter. The brutal physical demands of harvesting or plowing are temporarily paused. But that doesn't mean you're just chilling, pardon the pun, by the fire all day and night, living the medieval equivalent of retirement. Oh no! While the bulk of daylight hours in winter might involve necessary tasks like tending animals if you have them collecting fuel or fetching water, the long evenings inside your drafty, dim hut require different kinds of chores. Chores that can just barely be done under the meager, flickering light of the fire, and maybe a single smoky rushlight. Think about all the things you need to survive that aren't just food from the ground. Your clothes, your simple tools, your fishing nets if you live near water. These things break, they wear out. They need constant maintenance or production. And winter, with its enforced inactivity in the fields, was the time for that. It was the season of indoor crafts. Most peasants weren't full-time specialized craftspeople, but they possessed a range of basic skills necessary for self-sufficiency. So, as the darkness descends and the chill deepens out, come the materials for these evening tasks. For the women especially, the nights were filled with textile production. Wool needs to be cleaned and prepared, a process that involves washing, beating, and carding or combing to get the fibers aligned. This carding involves brushes with wire teeth scratching through the raw wool, slowly preparing it for spinning. Then comes the spinning itself, transforming those fluffy fibers into usable thread or yarn. This could be done with a drop spindle, a simple weighted stick that you twirl to twist the fiber as you pull it from a distaff, a stick holding the wool, or if you were a bit more fortunate or in a region where they were common, a basic spinning wheel. It's a repetitive finger-numbing task, made harder by the cold and the poor light. Imagine trying to keep your yarn even when you can barely see what you're doing. That spun yarn doesn't magically become clothing. It needed to be woven into cloth. While weaving on a large loom might take up significant space and wasn't feasible in every tiny hut, simpler looms existed, or pre-woven cloth might be finished and sewn at home. Clothes wore out constantly, the coarse wool rubbing against itself, and the tough environment took its toll. So, patching, mending, and sewing new simple tunics or leg coverings was a never-ending task by firelight. This was done with basic bone or iron needles and thick, rough thread. Sewing by rushlight sounds like a great way to stab yourself, frankly. Your fingers ache from the cold and the fiddly, poorly lit work. It's like playing Operation, but the buzzer is frostbite and the pieces are definitely not sterile. Men's tasks might involve repairing tools, sharpening scythe blades, fixing handles on hoes, mending baskets used for carrying goods. If you had any simple carpentry needs like fixing a stool leg or a loose doorboard, wishful thinking perhaps, but a peasant can dream winter was the time for it. Repairing leatherwork perhaps for shoes or bags might also happen. These tasks required concentration and often rough manual skill, again complicated by the lack of decent light. Trying to whittle or sharpen something in near darkness feels inherently risky, right? One slip and you're not just cold and hungry, you're injured and still cold and hungry, but also bleeding onto your probably not washed trousers. Mainstream historical fact: incoming textile production, particularly spinning and weaving of wool and linen, was a vital household activity in medieval peasant life, often filling the non-agricultural months. It wasn't just about making clothes for the family. Surplus yarn or cloth could be traded or was sometimes required as part of the feudal dues owed to the lord. So those long hours spinning weren't just about covering your legs. They were about meeting obligations or maybe earning a few precious extra coins. Beyond the practical repair and production, there were also general household chores, though limited in scope by the space and the darkness. Tending the fire was continuous. Sweeping the floor was probably more about pushing the surface layer of dirt, straw, and leftovers around than actually cleaning. Mucking out the corner where the calf or pig might be staying required occasional attention, adding its own aromatic signature to the already complex indoor air profile. Gathering straw to replenish the bedding involved going outside into the potentially deep cold, even just steps away, a quick dash that made the relative warmth of the hut smoky as it would seem heavenly in comparison. This indoor work was often done collectively as a family unit. Sitting around the fire, the limited pool of light, the only illumination, parents and older children would work on their respective tasks, perhaps teaching the younger ones simple skills like carding wool or tying basic knots. The quiet hum of activity filled the space. The whirring of a spindle, the soft scratch of carding combs, the dull thud of a hammer on a tool handle. The occasional curse when someone pricked themselves in the near darkness. Now, for a quirky detail, medieval peasants sometimes used a tool called a lucette for making cords or braids. It's a small two-pronged fork-like tool that allowed simple square or other shaped cords to be quickly and efficiently produced useful for lacing up garments, tying things, or even decorative trims. So even simple necessary items like string required specialized, albeit basic tools and skills developed and honed during these dark winter evenings. The repetitive nature of these tasks day after day, night after long night, combined with the cold, the poor diet, and the sheer lack of stimulation beyond the confines of your small, smoky world, must have been incredibly monotonous. There was no evening entertainment beyond basic storytelling or perhaps singing simple songs, more on that later. Just the drone of work by pale, uncertain light. Historians still argue whether the long, dark hours spent primarily on domestic production, often without significant social interaction beyond the immediate family, fostered a sense of isolation, or if the shared workspace and purpose around the hearth counteracted that monotony. From where you sit hunched over a pile of scratchy wool trying to tease out fibers you can barely see it, feels like a pretty isolated kind of togetherness, punctuated by the occasional coughing fit. As the rushlight sputters low, casting dramatic dancing shadows that make the familiar tools in your hand look momentarily sinister, you finish preparing another small amount of fiber. Just enough to keep your hands busy for another hour or so. There's always more wool to process, more thread to spin another tear in a tunic to mend before it unravels entirely. The work never really stops. It just changes form with the seasons trading brute force and fresh air for fine manipulation and perpetual dimness. And honestly, after hours of this, your eyes are tired. Your back aches from hunching, and the thought of putting down the scratchy fiber and just trying to sleep in the cold, despite all the discomfort, seems like a minor relief. Amidst the cold, the hunger, and the sheer relentless monotony, there's another, perhaps even greater, adversary stalking your medieval winter night sickness. You know the feeling of familiar tightness in your chest, the tickle in your throat that warns of a coming cough, the dull ache behind your eyes that signals a fever setting in? Living in close proximity to livestock, if applicable, and other people in poorly ventilated spaces with questionable sanitation and compromised diets means illness spreads like wildfire through the community. And winter, with the added stress of cold and scarcity, is peak season for catching something nasty. There were no vaccinations, no antibiotics, not even a medieval version of chicken soup from your local takeout place, which would also somehow be pottage. Getting sick wasn't just unpleasant. It was terrifyingly dangerous. A simple cold could turn into a fatal lung infection. A bad fever could take you out just as easily as starvation, or a run-in with an unhappy lord. You've probably felt it recently, the shared cycle of coughs echoing through the hut at night. One person gets sick, and within days it's moved through the household. It's just part of life. Sanitation standards, as you understand them, didn't exist. Waste disposal was crude. There were no sewers or regular garbage collection. The ground outside, and often the ground inside where people and animals lived, was a breeding ground for pathogens. Water sources could be contaminated, though brewing weak ale helped a little, as we discussed earlier, because the boiling and fermentation process killed some germs. But fetching water from a frozen well or stream in winter was its own hardship. You might break through the ice, risk frostbite, or find the water sources simply inaccessible. When you do get sick, your options for treatment are incredibly limited, and often based on folk remedies, superstition, or what little empirical knowledge has been passed down through generations. Herbal remedies are common. Brewing teas from specific plants known for their properties, making poultices from herbs and other substances, sometimes bizarre ones from our perspective, to draw out humors or ease pain. Maybe someone in the village is known for their knowledge of herbs, a sort of local wise woman or man, and you'd seek their advice, perhaps paying them in eggs or spun yarn. These remedies might offer some symptomatic relief, a tea to ease a cough perhaps, but they rarely address the underlying cause of bacterial or viral infections. Severe illnesses were a desperate time. Medieval understanding of disease was based largely on the theory of the four humors: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Sickness was believed to be caused by an imbalance of these humors in the body. Treatments aimed to restore balance, often through practices like bloodletting, Cutting a vein to release blood definitely not recommended for someone already weak and perhaps anemic from poor diet purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea, to expel excess humors or prescribing specific foods or activities to correct the perceived imbalance. It's less, take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning, and more, let's hope draining half your blood fixes that headache. It's medieval medicine, and it sounds deeply unpleasant and often actively harmful. Mainstream historical tidbit. Medieval medical theory, even among university-trained physicians who peasants would almost never see, was heavily influenced by ancient Greek and Roman ideas, particularly the theory of the 4 humors attributed to Hippocrates and Galen. Diagnosis and treatment were based on attempting to balance these internal bodily fluids. If you're feverish and coughing wrapped in your scratchy woolens lying on the damp, straw-covered floor, the cold feels even more intense. Your body aches, your head spins, and you feel profoundly vulnerable. The line between being uncomfortably cold and desperately ill can feel very thin. There's no escaping to a warm, dry bed or having a delivery of hydrating fluids. You endure it here in the same conditions you always live in, relying on the basic warmth of the fire, the body heat of others around you, and sheer willpower mixed with maybe some potent and probably foul-tasting herbal concoction. Sleep already a battle becomes even harder when you're racked with coughs or shivering with fever. Quirky illness tidbit. One popular medieval remedy for various ailments, believe it or not, was applying various poultices that could contain incredibly bizarre ingredients, ranging from herbs to animal excrement to ground-up stones. Yes, sometimes animal dung was seen as having medicinal properties. So if you heard about someone being treated for something, it might have involved slapping literal manure onto them. That's, certainly a medical practice. Makes you grateful for modern pharmacies, right? Oh, just need some antibiotics and hold the cow dung, thanks. Trying to care for someone who is severely ill was also incredibly difficult. Lacking basic hygiene knowledge and supplies, it was hard to prevent spreading the illness to others. Giving fluids was limited to water or thin gruel or that omnipresent weak ale. Keeping someone warm when the whole hut is cold is a challenge. The physical toll of sickness combined with the environmental hardships meant recovery was slow and by no means guaranteed. The knowledge that a bad cold or bout of influenza could sweep through a village and carry off the weakest, youngest, or oldest members was a constant grim backdrop to life, particularly in winter. Historians still argue whether the close cohabitation with livestock might have contributed to increased rates of certain zoonotic diseases passing between animals and humans. Living with animals offered warmth, but also potential health risks you couldn't comprehend at the time. You cough again, a harsh, dry sound that tears at your chest. Someone else coughs in response from the other side of the hut. It's a familiar symphony of winter illness. You pull your rough blanket closer, hoping that somehow, despite the conditions, your body can fight off whatever is trying to take hold. It's a common battle waged quietly, night after night, across every similar dwelling in the land. Your own physical weakness and vulnerability becomes starkly clear when stacked against the forces of nature and disease, a reminder that survival is never just guaranteed. It's something you have to fight for every single day, even and especially through the cold, dark, germy nights. Okay, so you're cold, potentially hungry, definitely itchy, struggling for light, and probably battling some low-grade illness or just the pervasive damp chill. It's a lot to deal with on your own, but here in your little hut, you're not entirely alone. That's a significant advantage of this simple dwelling. You share it with your immediate family, of course, parents, siblings, perhaps grandparents if they're still able to contribute or are being cared for, but potentially also with cousins or other relatives who make up the core household unit. Sometimes, as we mentioned, even the more valuable livestock, like a cow or pig, shared a section of the home offering some warmth and protection to both animals and humans. This isn't just a lack of privacy problem, it's a survival strategy. Body heat, simple as that. Multiple bodies in a confined space generate a surprising amount of heat. Huddling together around the fire or sharing a sleeping pallet piled with scratchy blankets and maybe sacks filled with straw for minimal insulation increases the cumulative warmth. It's like a biological convection oven, slightly less delicious but much more necessary. You can feel the warmth radiating from the person next to you, a small comfort in the surrounding chill. It's an intimate space, yes, sometimes uncomfortably, so filled with the sounds of breathing, shifting, coughing, and perhaps snoring. But in winter, that physical closeness is a form of survival. It's much warmer than sleeping alone in the corner. But it's not just about body heat. The shared space fosters a sense of community and mutual support. These long, dark evenings around the fire aren't solely dedicated to monotonous chores. While work is necessary, there are moments for conversation, for sharing the meager events of the day, for storytelling, and maybe even some simple games. Life wasn't just survival. There were moments, small flickers of human connection, and even a touch of entertainment to push back against the grim reality. Storytelling was crucial. Lacking books or widespread literacy, oral tradition kept history myths and local news alive. The oldest members of the household or community were valued keepers of these stories, recounting tales of ancestors, legendary figures, perhaps morality tales or explanations for the natural world. These stories filled the long, dark hours, fired the imagination, and provided a connection to the past and the shared culture of the village. You might hear tales of trickster animals, brave but foolish heroes, or maybe spooky stories about restless spirits roaming outside, which probably felt quite plausible on a stormy winter night in a drafty hut. Simple games might also be played using pebble sticks or carved bone. Nothing with fancy border pieces. Ingenuity born of necessity. Perhaps guessing games or simple rhyming games. Music, too, would have been present in the form of singing, maybe to pass the time during repetitive tasks like spinning or for simple pleasure. Not complex symphonies, but familiar folk tunes, work songs, or ballads about local events or characters. The sounds of singing or a shared story break the silence, making the dark seem a little less vast and threatening. Laughter, even if infrequent and muted by tiredness and the circumstances, was a powerful defense against despair. Mainstream historical detail for you. While their lives were incredibly difficult, medieval peasants were part of strong community structures. Mutual support, shared labor like barn raisings or communal harvesting, and reliance on neighbors in times of hardship or illness were essential aspects of their survival strategy. The household unit itself was the most fundamental form of this community. Beyond the immediate family, there was the wider village community. Although you are primarily huddled in your own dwelling tonight, you are acutely aware of the other huts clustered nearby. The pale glow of their fires might be visible through cracks, or the smoke holes, little beacons of parallel struggles against the cold. While socializing might be limited by weather or exhaustion, neighbors would rely on each other, particularly in emergencies. If someone's roof was damaged in a storm, others would help repair it. If illness struck hard, neighbors might share what little food or herbal remedies they had. This wasn't always idyllic. Village life could have its disputes, jealousies, and tensions just like any community. But at its core, there was a fundamental reliance on one another to get by. Quirky community detail. Archaeological evidence and historical records suggest that medieval peasant houses in a village were often clustered together relatively closely. This wasn't just about sharing resources or making village life easier. In harsher climates, it offered a measure of collective shelter and protection from the elements and perhaps even predators or raiders, effectively creating a slightly warmer, slightly safer microenvironment through sheer proximity of human and animal activity. Think of it as passive village warming. The shared struggle created a powerful, albeit often unspoken bond. You look across the dim space at your family members. Their faces are visible only by the flickering light, sometimes lost completely in shadow, but their presence is felt keenly. Their shared breaths add to the slightly steamy, smoky atmosphere. Their shared discomfort is mirrored in your own. You are not alone in this battle against the medieval winter night. It's a collective effort, passing a bit of rough bread, sharing the dwindling stew, huddling closer for warmth, murmuring encouragement when someone is coughing badly. These small acts of human connection were just as important as the roof over your head and the fire in the hearth. Historians still argue whether the strong communal bonds of medieval village life were a primary source of resilience for peasants facing harsh conditions, or if they were primarily a necessary adaptation driven by the demands of the feudal system and the sheer difficulty of independent survival. Probably a bit of both, to be honest. As you prepare to try and settle down for a few hours of restless, cold-interrupted sleep, you position yourself as close as you can to another warm body. The roughness of the wool against your face is a constant reminder of your reality, but the slow, steady breathing of someone beside you, the shared space around the dwindling fire offers a small but real comfort. You are part of this small unit facing the cold and the dark together. It's not easy, it's never easy, but you are not doing it alone. That shared presence, the collective attempt to generate enough heat and push back the silence with stories and breath, is a vital, intangible shield against the severity of the winter night. You're probably getting a pretty good picture by now of the physical hardships. The cold, the damp, the hunger, the illness, the itchy clothes, the basic shelter. But there was also a significant psychological toll from enduring the long, dark medieval winter. The days are short, just a few hours of pale, low-hanging sun, peeking over the horizon before sinking again, plunging everything back into deep shadow. The vast majority of your time from late autumn through early spring is spent in dimness or outright darkness. It's less early to bed, early to rise, and more, the sun's barely up before it's time to think about going back into hibernation, except you can't. This prolonged lack of natural light wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it had profound effects. Think about modern seasonal affective disorder cranked up to 11 and spread across 4 or 5 months. Your internal clock would be completely thrown off. There were no bright indoor lights to mimic daylight and regulate your circadian rhythms. Life slowed down dramatically because work was difficult or impossible after dark. This meant long hours of inactivity relative to the warmer months, combined with the limited physical space of your hut, the unchanging scenery, and the lack of external stimulation. It's the ultimate cabin fever endured with poor heating and repetitive tasks. The sheer sameness of it all weighed on you. Every day was much like the one before, centered around maintaining the fire, rationing food, performing those dim indoor chores, and just trying to stay warm and healthy. The landscape outside was likely monochromatic. White snow, brown earth, and trees, gray sky. There was no escape from the environment. The visual world contracted to the inside of your smoky dwelling, broken only by brief forays into the bleak, frigid outdoors for essential tasks. Your world became very small, very limited. The absence of significant variety or external input could be mentally draining. No news to speak of beyond local gossip. No new sights, no changing routines other than maybe the type of wood you were burning that day. This lack of novelty, combined with the physical stress of the cold and potential hunger, could breed a deep sense of ennui or maybe just flat-out depression. Imagine being tired, cold, slightly hungry, and just existing in perpetual dimness for months with nothing to look forward to except, hey, more of the same until maybe spring arrives. It required a different kind of resilience than facing a sudden crisis. It demanded endurance against a slow, creeping despair. Mainstream historical fact point. While the concept of clinical depression is modern historical accounts and peasant proverbs suggest recognition of the difficulty of enduring the long winter months, speaking of winter weariness or a lowering of spirits. The reduced activity and sunlight were significant environmental factors influencing mood and energy levels. Sleep itself was not necessarily restful. Interruptions from cold needing to tend the fire, shared space with snoring relatives or restless animals, and just general discomfort meant sleep was likely fractured and poor quality. Waking up repeatedly in the intense cold and darkness is physically and mentally draining. You never feel quite rested, adding to the pervasive sense of fatigue that permeated these months. Every day started from a deficit fighting not just the cold, but your own weariness. Then there's the element of fear and vulnerability inherent in the long nights. Darkness is inherently a little unsettling to humans, and in the medieval world without the artificial light we're used to, it was truly black and deep. Tales of bandits, wolves, or supernatural beings seemed more real in the total blackness beyond your door. Even inside, with shadows dancing in the firelight, the mind could play tricks. Every gust of wind sounded like something trying to get in. The simple act of stepping outside, even just to fetch an armload of wood, required confronting this tangible darkness and whatever might be lurking within it, perceived or real. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some regions, particular rituals or superstitions were associated with the longest nights and shortest days around the winter solstice. These could involve special bonfires because more fire is always a good idea in a place struggling with light feasting, if resources allowed, or practices meant to appease spirits or encourage the return of the sun and fertility to the land. These events perhaps offering a brief break from the routine highlight the mental impact of the endless dark and the deep human need for light and hope. Historians still debate whether the harsh living conditions and intense psychological pressures of medieval life contributed to higher rates of mental distress or particular psychological coping mechanisms. Given the unrelenting nature of the hardship, it's difficult to imagine these winters were good for anyone's overall mental health. It required an acceptance of hardship, a different mindset entirely. Your hopes and dreams were probably centered around basic survival. Getting enough food through the winter, hoping the next harvest was good, maybe marrying and having healthy children. Big existential thoughts probably took a backseat to the immediate need for warmth and not coughing up a lung. You look at the patch of wall opposite the fire swallowed by impenetrable blackness. It feels like the darkness outside is actively trying to creep in, filling any space not occupied by the firelight. There's a weight to it, a heavy cloak settling over everything. Battling this isn't done with physical strength. It's a quiet internal struggle for patience, endurance, and a refusal to completely surrender to the gloom. Waiting for the slow turn towards longer days becomes an almost physical ache of longing. Each sunrise, even if pale and brief, is a small victory against the long, dark siege of winter, a tiny injection of hope in the slow, wearisome fight against the chill that permeated not just your body, but threatened to seep into your very spirit. So you endure. You scrape by through the long, dark hours, battling the cold that seeps into your bones, the gnawing ache in your stomach, the perpetual sniffles, the endless monotony of dim work and static space. Each morning that you wake up still alive, however stiff and cold you feel, is another victory. Each sunset that doesn't find you completely starved, frozen, or felled by sickness is a battle survived. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, something begins to shift. The crushing weight of the darkest part of winter starts to ease. It's not a sudden flip of a switch, more like the universe slowly turning an enormous rusted key. The change is subtle. You might notice after weeks of near-total darkness, flanking the short daylight hours, that the sun seems to linger just a little longer on the horizon before it dips away. Sunrise is fractional seconds earlier, sunset fractional seconds later. Barely noticeable day to day, but after a week or two, the difference becomes clear. A tiny, fragile tendril of hope unfurls somewhere deep inside you. More daylight means more potential time for tasks. Less time spent simply enduring the biting cold and darkness, and the promise of the return of the vital warmth needed for crops to grow. It's a very physical manifestation of the turning year, and a profoundly important one for a peasant whose life is dictated by agricultural seasons. The ground outside, still likely hard as iron and covered in residual snow or patches of treacherous ice, might start to show microscopic signs of softening during the brief midday sun. Drip, drip, drip. A sound you might strain to hear. The slow, hesitant melting of accumulated ice or snow. A hint of mud begins to appear at the edges of puddles, where before there was only hard frost. The biting dry cold of deepest winter might give way slightly to a colder damper. Kind of chill, a reminder that thaw is messy and often colder feeling due to the increased moisture in the air. You might pull your hood tighter but secretly welcome the change. However uncomfortable the transitional phase. Its progress, however damp and uncomfortable. Your thoughts, which have been relentlessly focused on simply getting through the current day or night, start to inch towards the future. You start thinking about the seed corn you've carefully guarded through the winter, making sure rodents haven't gotten to it and that it hasn't become moldy in the damp hut. You think about the state of your tools. Are they ready for the punishing work of breaking ground after the thaw? You anticipate the returning migratory birds, another natural signal that the seasons are turning. Hearing the first distant call of a species that only appears in warmer months must have been an incredibly powerful moment. A sonic harbinger of spring, After months of a muted winter soundscape dominated by wind, and maybe the distant call of resident animals. Mainstream historical fact alert. The medieval agricultural year was entirely centered around the seasonal cycle of planting, growing, and harvesting. Spring planting, especially of grains like barley and oats, was the absolutely critical period that determined the food supply for the next year. Surviving winter was necessary to reach the crucial spring labor season, which was intense and demanding. The end of winter wasn't just the end of hardship, it was the prelude to back-breaking work. While the hungry gap might be reaching its most desperate point, the need to prepare for the coming planting season overshadowed immediate discomforts. The prospect of warmer days and more food in the future was the motivation. There's no medieval equivalent of a spring break vacation here. It's just shifting from the passive battle against cold and hunger to the active, incredibly hard labor of getting seeds into the ground in time to hopefully maybe yield a harvest before the next autumn frosts. It's less a light at the end of the tunnel and more a bigger, warmer tunnel requiring heavy lifting at the end of this tunnel. A tunnel with, you guessed it, questionable nutrition involved. The chores might shift slightly, focusing less on fire maintenance and more on tasks related to tool repair and field preparation that could be done on slightly milder days even before the main thaw. Perhaps preparing wooden pegs for marking rows or sharpening plowshares if you had access to such things. There's a subtle increase in energy, a collective anticipation stirring within the household and the village. Conversations might turn to the state of the land signs of an early or late thaw, concerns about spring floods or late frost that could jeopardize the planting. Here's a quirky little tidbit. Some regional folklore or simple traditions mark the easing of winter's grip. These weren't necessarily official church holidays, but local customs tied to the natural calendar, like specific days considered auspicious for the first fieldwork or minor feast, celebrated using the last of dwindling stores, which makes it sound less like a feast and more like an inventory clearance sale to symbolically welcome the lengthening days. These traditions underscore how deeply connected peasants were to the natural rhythms and how significant even minor signs of spring's approach must have been. You catch yourself looking towards the smoke hole, not just because smoke is bothering your eyes, but seeing if the quality of the gray light filtering through seems marginally less grim. A tiny sliver of brighter sky, a slight change in wind direction suggesting a less northerly Arctic blast. You grasp at these signs, letting the slow anticipation build. It's not just waiting for warmth, it's waiting for life to return to the land that sustains you. Waiting for the world outside your smoky box to green and grow again. Historians still argue whether the strong correlation between seasonal agricultural cycles and peasant routines fostered a particularly robust mental resilience, or if it simply instilled a deep, fatalistic acceptance of hardship, punctuated by brief periods of intense labor and moderate sustenance. Watching the thaw seems to require a healthy dose of both acceptance and quiet, determined hope. You hear a slight cracking sound outside. Was that the ice on the nearby puddle? You listen intently, ignoring the persistent itch from your woolens. It might be nothing, or it might be a signal. Every tiny indication that the cold's absolute dominion is lessening feels disproportionately significant. After months of enduring the simple anticipation of working hard in actual daylight, perhaps without shivering, constantly feels almost luxurious. You curl up once more, drawing your inadequate covering around you. But this time the thought of sleep carries not just the weight of ending another difficult day, but also the subtle nascent hope of eventual slow relief. Spring isn't here yet. Not by a long shot, but you've survived the worst of it, and now you wait.